would be for future employees. This wouldn't be just yanking somebody's pension. It would be to deal with it for the future. We've got to come to that. And emphasize total compensation. More and more of our companies are doing that. We do that at our shop. We let, a person has a salary, but they get health care, they get a 401k match, they get this and that, vacation, and we add all that up and we show folks, by the way, your total package is this. And we think that's important just for people to know what all they're getting as a part of their package. Now, this is a new addition to this report, and I'll quickly summarize here. But we've added principles for spending, for getting our house in order. We've talked about this a lot in our shop as to what the business community would consider to be responsible budget making. Number one, limit spending to 6% of the state's economy. Now, there are those, some in the audience here, who would say, no, state government, there are so many needs, we really need to expand state government to address those needs. That's a fair policy debate, but in our view, 20 years of history of state government getting by on 6% of the gross state product, we would say there's a fair amount of momentum in that direction, and we would consider that a reasonable benchmark for containing state government. Secondly, limit borrowing costs to 6%. I refer back to former finance director, now U of L president Jim Ramsey, who advocated this in the Patton administration, that it's reasonable and bond agencies want to see that you're keeping control of what you're putting on the credit card. We would suggest that 6%, which has been advocated by folks like Ramsey and others, as a reasonable ceiling. Eliminate structural deficit, in other words, taking one-time money and putting it into just to patch up a budget. That's been a temptation all along in Frankfort. Prioritize investing in the future. What does that mean? Well, things that I think most in this room would agree with, and most citizens of Kentucky would agree with: educating our children, sending people to college, promoting economic development. Those types of things that are investments in our future, as opposed to dealing with our societal problems and spending more and more money on prisons, runaway pension costs, poor lifestyles, the Medicaid cost of poor lifestyles, etc. And last but not least, reestablish a rainy day fund. We all know what that means. That's been tapped in the last during this Great Recession, and we need to reestablish that. Why is this urgent? Well, the Pew Center's ratings that they came out with and said we're in bad shape. Secondly, federal stimulus funds have run out. Let me show you one chart on that. The headlines that we haven't read for the last couple of years, whether you like federal stimulus or not, the headlines we haven't read is that the soccer coach at Dunbar High School was laid off for lack of money and cutbacks, or that the chorus teacher at the middle school across town was laid off because of lack of money. Basically, the stimulus money has propped up states, and specifically state school systems. You can see how much went into Medicaid. Second line is education, if you can't read it from where you are. Third is roads and bridges. Health and welfare. The fifth line is general fund, $120 million. Well, the budget year that we're in started 12 days ago, July 1. That's the 2012 budget of the state of Kentucky. All the stimulus money will have been spent in this year. There will be none, to my knowledge, in 13 or 14. And when the legislature comes back to Frankfort in January, they have to write a budget now without federal stimulus dollars. It's going to be tough. So, back to why is it urgent? The Pew study, federal stimulus funds have run out, and Moody's downgraded Kentucky's bond rating. So that, to the best of our ability, summarizes where we see Frankfort. Substantial progress on the 3 leaks that we pointed out in 2009. But clearly not enough, as this slide demonstrates. So with that, I'd like to ask John Cubine, Brian Sunderland, who's our Vice President of Public Affairs, does a terrific job for us, Bob Gray, and Diane, are you joining us? Or, please. This is brain trust, so you fire questions, and the easy ones I'll take, and the hard ones I'll deflect. Are there questions about the leaky bucket or any of what we've just said? By the way, I would say that although some folks were naturally uncomfortable with our first report, I haven't had anyone seriously question the facts that were contained in that report. And it's not a Republican or a Democratic message. It's not business community picking on anybody, Medicaid recipients or public employees. It's mathematics. To some extent, it's demographics. But it's mathematics, economics. It's stuff that jumps off the page when you get a calculator out. So that's how we present it, and we would invite discussion of those findings. Questions? I'll ask these folks for what have I left out? You have a microphone, somebody? Go ahead, Brian.
Time to criticize the boss in front of a crowd of 250 people. This is perfect.
That's right.
Overall, as we look at it, and pensions, I think, is the number one thing that we look at going forward as far as being a strain, a constant strain on our budget year after year, is trying to find out how we're going to pay back that liability. While that liability increases, the healthcare costs continue to increase. Both Moody's and Fitch noted not only the pension, but the structural deficit within our state budget, and that is where we have shifted money around. We've used federal stimulus dollars, and certain accounts have been swept and spent on certain recurring expenses. You do that for too many years, and you have to catch up, and we have to get back to a conservative, fiscally responsible budget that's going to allow us to borrow at a good rate, to invest in these sort of infrastructure that we have, that we need, and that will create jobs in the future. So I would argue that while we've made progress in 3 areas we pointed out in 2009, our greatest challenge probably going forward is the public pension systems and what they mean in terms of long-term costs to the state.
Bob Gray.
There was a mention of the structural deficit in the budget. On page 5 of the report you have, we provide a little detail of that. We think that's very important for one simple reason. There's been a fair amount of reporting about the surplus the state has been getting in unanticipated revenue that has been reported recently. And while that's good news for Kentucky's economy and for state government, you have to consider the fact that we have more than a $400 million structural deficit in our budget, which is essentially using one-time money to balance the budget instead of recurring revenue. So even with this additional money that the state has gotten in receipts, we still have a huge amount to make up next year, and it's why these issues that we outline in here become even that much more important, because we've got, the legislature will have to balance the budget in January, and there's a hole there that has to be made up. And John, you have
I might just add to what Bob mentioned, is that structural deficit, and certainly Senator Williams is here, and he is certainly aware of it, the General Assembly, what they face in the 2012 session, is when you have a structural deficit, there's always the debate about if you have extra money, do you spend it or do you let it sit there? Do you cut programs or do you spend it? The problem with the structural deficit and what the 2012 General Assembly will find itself is that Kentucky's going to be about $8.6 billion, $8.8 billion in terms of general fund receipts. If we have a 3, 4, 5% growth, and you've got a $400 million structural deficit, you basically enter fiscal 13 with no new money. Even though you have money, it's to cover what you're already spending the previous year. So it's very hard to go and explain to the citizens how you can have $400 million or $500 million in new money, but there is no money. And that's because, in fact, by using one-time money, you have to fill it with your reoccurring revenue the next year.
Diana Taylor.
I think you have a future as some kind of a talk show host, Dave. We heard some comments this morning from our friends in the media. I think my friend Al Cross mentioned tax modernization or tax reform. And yes, we do hear a lot of that conversation in Frankfort, and we'll continue to hear that. Regardless of where you are on that issue, regardless of whether you think government has enough money or too little money for funding the programs that are particularly important, unless and until these unsustainable areas of spending are addressed, it isn't going to matter how much money we bring into Frankfurt, because the drain, the leaks in the bucket will persist. That's why we're so encouraged seeing the progress that Dave has articulated just over the past few months. Those of us who have been around Frankfurt for longer than we care to remember know what a big deal it is to see changes like this getting made, because the very nature of public policy is that it is very slow moving. It can be frustrating, but it also can be productive. So one thing that we like to keep uppermost, at least some of us in our minds, is regardless of the size of the bucket, unless you plug the leaks, there's still not going to be the kind of money we need for education and economic development and programs that truly build the future.
I'd like to call on somebody and pick on her for just a minute to ask her to come up. Crit Llewellyn, Auditor of the State of Kentucky, you have a unique view on pensions. Could you step up there and tell us what you were mentioning? How's that? Just pick on her. She asked for this. She ran for office. Mention what you've just done an audit of the pension system. What were you saying about the first 20 pages of your report?
I was just back there minding my own business. We just completed a special examination of the retirement system because there had been a number of questions that had been raised there, particularly about an issue regarding the use of placement agents on investments. But as part of our report of the pension system, a couple of points. This report, which is on our website, auditor.ky.gov, I asked our staff to do the research and to develop a background so that the first about 20 pages, 25 pages of this report is an excellent background and history of the state pension system, how we got to where we are today, and what our long-term liabilities are. And you all have done a good bit of this similar kind of work, but this is a very helpful document. We presented it to the General Assembly Committee on State Government a couple of weeks ago, and I encourage them to use this background we developed as policymakers. The point we made in our audit, once we got past some of the specific questions we've been asked to look into, was that the state has an obligation for those employees who are already in that pipeline, and we have to figure out how to fully fund the liability we have. That's separate and apart from the debate over whether we want to change the future for employees coming into the system and moving to a completely different approach, which would be a defined contribution rather than a defined benefit. We didn't opine on that. We just put a lot of background and good information in it. The other important part of our report was over 92 recommendations to the board of the retirement systems regarding governance. We found a board that is not as fully engaged as it should be, particularly as it relates to investments. You mentioned investment strategy, Dave. We made a number of good recommendations to get this board more fully engaged, to ensure that they're better qualified, fully qualified for the job they have, because whatever political solution is hammered out about what happens to the retirement system, it has to have strong governance. And that was really the focus of our report. And I think the most important outcome of our report was the issues related to governance of the existing system, that and the background section that I mentioned.
Great.
And I'm not staying up here for any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate the work you do. You know, shifting gears for just a minute to the public employee health benefits, in Leaky Bucket 1, we asked for what we thought was a fairly common sense contribution by public employees to their health insurance. We suggested, and we just threw this out, it was kind of a swag recommendation, but we said $50 a month. It was less than 10% of the cost of the average health insurance policy for state employees, but $50 a month would be reasonable, especially considering that the average of companies that provide health insurance, of the companies that provide health insurance, and many do not anymore, as you know, the average employee share is 20%. So we suggested $50 a month just to kind of get the discussion out there. And, of course, there was considerable pushback on that. Why are we picking on public employees? Well, my wife's a retired teacher who's not yet 65. And I'll use her as an example because I want to compliment the Kentucky teachers' retirement system. Quietly, without fanfare, without cameras and press coverage, the retirement system convened stakeholders. And, Mary Ann, you were probably in those meetings representing KEA, the teachers' union. The school boards, school administrators, 8 or 10 groups, weren't there? And they dealt with reality that the health insurance cost of their retirement system was shaking the foundations of their retirement system. And so they came back with a consensus set of a consensus set of recommendations, and it went through the House and the Senate, got signed into law because they had done the hard work. Well, my wife, using her as the example, as of last year, would have gotten 100% of her health insurance as a retired teacher. This year, starting October 1, she had to pay $30-something. Next year, it goes to $83, and the next year, $134. So she says, ouch, of course, because she's used to getting 100%, but her retirement system now lives to fight another day and provide her monthly pension check. So that's a case where I think some common sense was brought to by all the stakeholders, the employee groups and the state legislature, to try to fix that. Now, the other retirement systems, the KRS, needs attention too, more so than just the 2008 reforms that were made. Yes, back in the back there's a question or a comment.
Hi, Dave. Elaine Walker, Secretary of State, and I'm going to wear my former mayor of Bowling Green hat and former president of the Kentucky League of Cities. Thank you for bringing this pension discussion to the forefront, because as a former local elected official, I can tell you that the frustration that we had was very great. Of course, we were dealing with a system that we were mandated to participate in, and local governments don't have a choice of whether or not they participate. They must pay the amount that comes due or face, I believe it's a $5,000 a day penalty. Unfortunately, the state doesn't have that same situation, and so we have consistently, the Kentucky League of Cities, consistently called upon the state legislature to increase their funding for the employee retirement system. The other concern that we had as local elected officials was the fact that we really were not at the table making those decisions about how to manage it. And so I encourage you to thank your local elected officials for the work that they do, because they don't have a choice and they do step to the plate, and to encourage the state legislature to take this on. It's a critical issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Excellent comment. Talk to your mayors and county judges about the benefits and pensions, and their huge issues there that they're dealing with, because they want to do the parks and the softball fields and the other things that you want them to do, but they're just being hammered by this check that they have to write every year to Frankfurt to cover their pension liabilities. Bob?
I just want to mention quickly that the legislature has addressed this issue in the 2008 legislation that Dave mentioned by establishing a schedule through which they're upping their contribution for pensions for state employees, moving toward full funding. So there has been legislative action on that.
Good.
I was going to mention and follow up on Bob, and I did mean before Representative Adkins is here also, and both he and Senator Williams have grappled with these budget issues and some of these decisions for years, and they're not easy ones. And as Secretary of State Walker said, local governments, which cities and counties belong to, have basically been paying their actuarial rate. State government has not. State government in this current year will pay close to 19%. The actuarial rate is about 40%, and Senate Bill 8 that was passed by the General Assembly in 2008 eventually gets the state to that full actuarial rate. But that gives you some idea, because state employees also get Social Security, so you have to add those together because they pay their Social Security. But all that goes into that total pension package.
Other comments or thoughts? Yes, over here in the corner. Mr. Owensboro.
To Mr. Owensboro. Is there any question or discussion about quasi-governmental entities and their relationship to the unfunded liabilities, or strengthening or tightening of those new enrollees also?
Good point. There was a big article last Sunday in the paper about that, I think, that got a lot of attention. Comments?
That's not something that this particular report addresses. Most of the research that went into this was prior to that information coming out. We're looking at it, but now that certain entities have opted into it, I don't think they have a way of getting out.
Right. Various nonprofit groups have gone to Frankfurt and said, hey, put us in the system, and a bunch of them have ended up there. which increases the liability even more.
And there are some, because they have to pay the full freight, there are some that probably at this point are beginning to regret that choice because of the high liability that they have to pay.
Seeing Elaine Walker and hearing her comment from her mayorship in Bowling Green reminds me, she and I have something in common. We both used to be mayors. And when I was mayor in Owensboro, I remember when I was 41, a few years ago, I got an invitation on my desk from a high school classmate of mine, same age as I am. He was retiring from the police department after 20 years of, quote, hazardous duty. Well, good for him. He served the community well. Those were the rules of the game. He was eligible for retirement. But at age 41, and he has now a pension. I haven't kept up with Mike, but I assume he is still enjoying that pension. His survivor would enjoy that, plus health care and survivor health care. So if either of them live till 91 years old, which is very possible, I hope they do, serve 20 years in hazardous duty pay, 50 years of benefits afterward. And just the question becomes, can we afford that? How can we afford that sort of thing? Any other questions? Got 2 more minutes for rebuttal. Anybody? There.
Like double dipping of public employees.
Double dipping. One of you guys want to take that one? Oh, wait, not the state government retirees. They're working for the business sector now. Brian, you know more about that than I do.
It's an issue that a number of people have looked at. There are some, public officials in Frankfort who rightly are going to take advantage of the situation, and they're going to retire, or they're going to actually lose money because that's the system they're in. There are some of those folks that I think it could easily be argued that have the skills, the qualifications, the knowledge, that it makes sense for state government to utilize their talents and say, hey, we'd like you to continue in this job. There are probably a whole cadre of folks out there who are taking advantage of that situation. Where you draw that line, that distinction, the General Assembly's looked at that issue, but so far has not actually taken legislative action to outlaw the practice because in some cases legislators are also taking advantage of that situation.
Thank you, Brian. In conclusion, I would just offer the Leaky Bucket, or Building a Stronger Bucket report, as our attempt to update the community, the state, about how we see things happening, the progress that has been made, and it's been real, but it has not been yet enough. And we didn't get into these problems overnight. I mean, it took decades to work our way into some of this, and so it will take shoulder-to-the-wheel type effort to keep trying to correct these problems. No one brought the report down from Mount Sinai on stone tablets and said, here it is, take it or leave it. It's up for debate. It's up for your consideration. We would appreciate the dialogue that it might stir around the state about how we fix these problems. Thank you very much.